In July 2001, an Australian wine producer entered the American market with distribution logic that systematically contradicted established industry principles. Traditional producers operated according to complexity hierarchies, aging requirements, and consumer sophistication development models that had remained unchanged for centuries. Their systems assumed wine purchase decisions required education about tannins, vineyard prestige, and varietal complexity. Casella Winery deployed consumer engagement architecture that eliminated these friction points, targeting the 85% of American adults who viewed wine as intimidating and pretentious. The product succeeded beyond all projections, expecting 25,000 cases, but selling 225,000 in year one, reaching 25 million cases by 2005 to become America's top imported wine. Market displacement occurred because two incompatible design philosophies regarding consumer behavior could not coexist within the same decision space. This disruption reveals how embedded industry assumptions create systematic vulnerability patterns that make market leaders structurally unable to respond to architectural innovation. How can established competitors become systematically incapable of defending against inferior execution of superior consumer architecture? The American wine industry in 2001 operated according to architectural principles that had remained fundamentally unchanged for centuries. These design assumptions created systematic vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when challenged by alternative consumer engagement logic. The industry's foundational theorem held that complexity, aging sophistication, and connoisseur education requirements directly correlated with consumer value creation. This premise shaped every aspect of competitive behavior, distribution architecture, and market expansion strategy. The market operated through a bifurcated structure consisting of premium and budget segments. Premium producers competed on complexity markers: vineyard prestige, aging duration, tannin sophistication, oak integration, and varietal distinction. Budget producers competed primarily on price while maintaining simplified versions of traditional complexity signals. Both segments assumed that wine appreciation required consumer education and palate development over time. This educational prerequisite functioned as a quality validation mechanism within industry logic. Industry feedback systems reinforced complexity bias through interconnected validation loops. Wine show competitions evaluated products according to technical sophistication criteria established by winemakers and expert judges. Critical rating systems emphasized complexity appreciation and educated palate requirements. Sommelier education programs transmitted technical knowledge that emphasized distinction recognition and appreciation development. Retail staff training focused on communicating sophisticated product attributes to consumers. These feedback mechanisms created self-reinforcing assumptions about consumer preferences and market expansion potential. The distribution architecture reflected these design premises through systematic organization principles. Wine retail environments sorted products geographically by region, alphabetically by vineyard, or categorically by varietal complexity. Shelf presentation assumed consumer willingness to navigate technical distinctions and education requirements. Label communication emphasized heritage, aging, and sophistication markers rather than accessibility or immediate satisfaction indicators. Purchase decision frameworks required consumer investment in appreciation development rather than immediate gratification. However, market performance data indicated systematic architectural failure rather than insufficient consumer sophistication. Alternative alcoholic beverages captured 3 times the market volume compared to wine consumption. Beer, spirits, and ready-to-drink cocktails dominated consumer preference, despite offering ostensibly inferior complexity and sophistication attributes. Consumer research consistently demonstrated that 85% of American adults viewed wine as intimidating, pretentious, and requiring cultivation of discerning taste that they were unwilling to develop. Industry responses to these market signals demonstrated design assumption entrenchment rather than architectural questioning. Producers interpreted low wine consumption as insufficient consumer education rather than systematic exclusion through complexity requirements. Marketing strategies emphasized appreciation development and sophistication cultivation rather than barrier elimination. Expansion efforts focused on existing wine drinker retention and education rather than non-consumer acquisition through accessibility improvement. The critical design failure centered on information architecture mismatch between industry optimization goals and market expansion requirements. Wine industry systems optimized for communicating sophisticated distinctions to educated consumers who represented a small minority of potential market participants. Market expansion required engaging consumer populations who explicitly rejected sophistication requirements and education investment. Traditional competitive logic prevented recognition that consumer avoidance patterns indicated architectural failure rather than marketing execution insufficiency. Competitive dynamics within the industry reinforced these design limitations through benchmarking behavior that focused on existing competitor capabilities rather than alternative consumer engagement approaches. Producers competed through superior execution within established complexity frameworks rather than questioning fundamental assumptions about consumer behavior and value creation. Differentiation strategies emphasized greater sophistication rather than accessibility improvement. Cost leadership approaches maintained complexity signals while optimizing price points within traditional competitive parameters. The industry's core assumption that education would expand markets proved structurally incorrect when tested against consumer behavior evidence. Educational initiatives increased complexity appreciation among existing wine consumers, but failed to convert non-consumers who viewed education requirements as entry barriers rather than value propositions. Marketing campaigns, emphasizing sophistication and heritage, reinforced exclusion mechanisms rather than expanding addressable market populations. This architectural foundation created predictable vulnerability patterns that would make systematic disruption inevitable when challenged by alternative design logic. The industry's optimization for existing consumer satisfaction within complexity frameworks prevented recognition of vastly larger market opportunities through barrier elimination and accessibility improvement. Traditional competitive responses would prove structurally inadequate because they addressed optimization within flawed architectural premises rather than questioning fundamental design assumptions about consumer behavior and value creation mechanisms. The conditions that enabled systematic market disruption existed within the industry's human factors architecture and organizational constraints long before any competitive challenge emerged. These latent vulnerabilities centered on research methodology bias, partnership structural advantages, and systematic misinterpretation of consumer behavior patterns. The critical technical artifact that exposed these conditions was the fundamental divergence between traditional wine industry consumer research methods and alternative analytical approaches that focused on non-consumer populations. Traditional wine industry consumer research operated through established methodologies that reinforced existing assumptions about target market composition and preferences. Research activities concentrated on wine country visits, winery tours, tasting events, and wine and cheese social gatherings. These environments attracted consumers who already demonstrated wine appreciation and sophistication tolerance. Survey populations consisted primarily of existing wine drinkers with developed palates and education investment willingness. Focus group participants were recruited from wine club memberships, sommelier networks, and retail environments that presupposed sophistication interest. This research methodology created systematic sampling bias that prevented recognition of vastly larger consumer populations with different behavioral patterns and value preferences. Non-wine drinkers remained invisible within traditional research frameworks because they avoided wine-focused environments and activities. Their preferences, barriers, and potential value propositions never entered industry consideration because research design excluded their participation. Market analysis focused on existing consumer retention and satisfaction rather than non-consumer acquisition through barrier elimination. Casella wines possessed structural characteristics that forced alternative analytical approaches when traditional competitive strategies proved unavailable. The family's vineyard operations lacked European heritage credentials that enabled traditional premium market positioning. Their Australian origins prevented competition on prestige, history, and sophisticated terroir distinctions that defined premium wine competitive advantages. Budget market competition required scale economies and distribution relationships that exceeded their operational capabilities. These constraints forced systematic analysis of alternative market positioning possibilities. The partnership structure between Casella Wines and W.J. Deutsch Distribution created operational advantages that larger corporate entities could not replicate. Both organizations operated as family businesses with decision-making authority concentrated among principals rather than distributed through corporate hierarchy systems. This structure enabled strategic pivots, risk tolerance, and commitment levels impossible within publicly held companies driven by quarterly earnings optimization and shareholder return requirements. Family ownership facilitated long-term investment perspectives that corporate governance structures systematically discouraged. Market timing provided distribution channel availability precisely when Yellowtail required access infrastructure. Deutsch had lost major Australian wine brands when Rosemount and Southcorp consolidated their distribution arrangements with larger national distributors. This consolidation created partnership opportunities for smaller operations like Deutsch while providing market access for emerging brands like Yellowtail. The timing alignment enabled rapid distribution scaling that would have required years to develop under normal competitive conditions. Consumer behavior analysis conducted through alternative research methodologies revealed systematic industry misunderstanding about market expansion opportunities. Rather than conducting research in wine country and sophisticated consumption environments, analysis focused on beer halls, honky-tonk establishments, drive-through liquor stores, and casual social drinking venues. These environments attracted consumers who valued simplicity, immediate satisfaction, and social accessibility over education requirements and sophistication development. Research findings demonstrated that non-wine drinker populations actively avoided wine purchases due to complexity intimidation rather than insufficient appreciation or quality concerns. Consumers preferred beverages that provided predictable satisfaction without education investment, terminology navigation, or sophisticated appreciation development. Beer and cocktail preferences indicated demand for accessible, fun, and socially comfortable drinking experiences. Wine industry sophistication requirements functioned as systematic exclusion mechanisms that prevented market participation rather than quality indicators that enhanced value propositions. Market size analysis revealed that non-wine drinker populations represented 3 times the volume potential compared to existing wine consumers. Traditional industry focus on existing customer retention and sophistication enhancement ignored vastly larger addressable markets through accessibility improvement and barrier elimination. Consumer surveys indicated willingness to try wine products that eliminated intimidation factors and complexity requirements while maintaining quality and social acceptability. Industry training and retail systems demonstrated systematic misalignment with actual consumer behavior patterns and preferences. Retail staff education emphasized technical knowledge transmission and sophistication communication rather than accessibility facilitation and barrier reduction. Store organization principles assumed consumer willingness to navigate complex categorization systems and technical distinction requirements. Purchase assistance focused on education provision rather than simplified selection and immediate satisfaction optimization. The human factors analysis revealed that traditional wine industry competitive logic prevented recognition of architectural opportunities through consumer exclusion elimination. Training programs, research methodologies, and market analysis frameworks reinforced existing assumptions about consumer behavior rather than challenging fundamental premises about value creation and market expansion. Organizational incentives rewarded sophistication enhancement and existing customer satisfaction, rather than accessibility improvement and non-consumer acquisition. These latent conditions created systematic vulnerability to alternative approaches that questioned fundamental industry assumptions about consumer behavior and value creation mechanisms. Traditional research methodology bias prevented recognition of market expansion opportunities through simplification and accessibility improvement. Corporate structural constraints limited strategic flexibility and risk tolerance required for architectural innovation. Industry training systems reinforced complexity bias rather than consumer accessibility optimization. The combination of research methodology limitations, corporate structural constraints, and systematic consumer behavior misinterpretation created conditions where alternative analytical approaches could identify vastly superior market opportunities through assumption challenge and architectural redesign. Traditional industry participants remained constrained by embedded human factors systems that prevented recognition of fundamental competitive vulnerabilities and alternative value creation possibilities. In July 2001, Casella Winery executed a market entry strategy that systematically violated every established principle of wine industry competitive logic. The launch of Yellowtail represented not merely a new product introduction, but a comprehensive architectural challenge to fundamental industry assumptions about consumer value creation, competitive differentiation, and market expansion mechanisms. The critical technical artifact that drove this divergence was the implementation of the 4 actions framework, a systematic methodology that eliminated traditional competitive factors, reduced industry standard practices, raised pricing above budget categories, and created entirely new accessibility features. Initial market projections reflected traditional industry expectations for unknown brand performance in competitive environments. Casella anticipated selling 25,000 cases in the first year, a modest target consistent with conventional wisdom about new market entrants without established distribution relationships, brand recognition, or premium positioning credentials. These expectations derived from standard industry models that predicted consumer adoption rates based on sophistication communication, education investment, and gradual market penetration through traditional competitive channels. The product architecture implemented through Yellowtail systematically eliminated competitive factors that the wine industry considered fundamental quality indicators and value drivers. Aging requirements were eliminated entirely, removing both cost infrastructure and complexity, signaling that traditional producers viewed as essential differentiation mechanisms. Varietal selection was reduced to 2 options, Chardonnay and Shiraz, eliminating the choice paralysis and expertise requirements that characterized traditional wine retail experiences. Technical terminology was removed from all labeling and marketing communications, replacing industry-standard sophistication signals with simplified grape variety identification and brand recognition elements. Label design and packaging created visual disruption within traditional wine retail environments through deliberate violation of established aesthetic conventions. The vibrant kangaroo imagery against black background contrasted sharply with traditional white labels that emphasized geographical origins, vintage years, and heritage indicators. Traditional wine organization systems sorted products geographically by region, alphabetically by vineyard, or categorically by varietal complexity. Yellowtail's visual design enabled distinct brand block creation that stood apart from conventional organizational schemes while facilitating rapid consumer recognition without expertise requirements. Taste profile optimization targeted beer and cocktail drinker preferences rather than traditional wine enthusiast expectations. The production process specifically reduced tannin and acid levels that wine experts considered essential complexity indicators and quality markers. Fruit-forward sweetness was enhanced to provide immediate palatability without acquired taste development requirements. The smooth finish eliminated harsh characteristics that traditional wine appreciation required consumers to learn to enjoy over time. This flavor architecture provided instant satisfaction comparable to familiar beverage categories while maintaining wine product category participation. Distribution channel strategy bypassed traditional wine retail education systems that assumed consumer sophistication investment willingness. Marketing efforts concentrated on in-store promotions utilizing retail employees as product ambassadors rather than mass media advertising, sommelier education, or wine publication review cultivation. Retail staff felt comfortable recommending products they understood without requiring extensive technical knowledge or sophistication communication capabilities. Point-of-sale materials emphasized simplicity and accessibility rather than complexity appreciation and education development. The packaging innovation extended beyond visual design to functional retail integration advantages. Yellowtail utilized identical bottle shapes for both red and white wine varieties, simplifying manufacturing processes while creating consistent brand recognition across product categories. This standardization eliminated traditional wine industry practices that used different bottle architectures to signal sophistication levels and regional heritage characteristics. Uniform packaging reduced production complexity, while enhancing retail efficiency and consumer familiarity. First-year sales performance demonstrated immediate market validation that exceeded all traditional industry prediction models. Actual sales reached 225,000 cases, representing 9 times the projected volume and indicating systematic consumer response rather than temporary market anomaly or seasonal fluctuation. Sales acceleration continued with 200,000 cases in 2001, expanding to 2.2 million cases in 2002, demonstrating sustained demand growth that traditional wine industry expansion models could not explain through existing competitive frameworks. Market response patterns revealed fundamental divergence between traditional industry assumptions about consumer behavior and actual purchasing decision frameworks. Consumers embraced simplified selection processes, immediate satisfaction delivery, and accessibility without education investment requirements. Purchase volumes indicated that complexity elimination enhanced, rather than diminished, consumer value perception. Repeat purchasing patterns suggested that traditional industry assumptions about sophistication requirements for consumer satisfaction were systematically incorrect. Traditional industry competitive responses proved structurally inadequate because they addressed optimization challenges within existing architectural frameworks rather than questioning fundamental design premises. Established producers could not replicate Yellowtail's success without abandoning core identity characteristics that define their market, positioning, production capabilities, and consumer relationship structures. Premium wine producers faced impossible choices between maintaining sophistication credentials that define their brand value or adopting accessibility strategies that would undermine their existing market positioning. Budget wine producers similarly lacked capability to respond effectively because their competitive advantages relied on cost optimization within traditional complexity frameworks rather than architectural redesign toward accessibility and barrier elimination. Their production systems, distribution relationships, and marketing capabilities were optimized for price competition rather than consumer experience transformation. Alternative positioning required fundamental business model redesign that exceeded their operational flexibility and resource allocation capabilities. The divergence point crystallized when traditional competitive logic proved insufficient to explain or respond to Yellowtail's market performance. Industry analysis frameworks that focused on existing competitor benchmarking, traditional quality indicator optimization, and conventional market segmentation approaches could not account for demand creation through consumer exclusion elimination. Traditional competitive responses that emphasized superior sophistication, enhanced education provision, or optimized price points within existing frameworks failed to address the fundamental architectural advantages that Yellowtail achieved through assumption challenge and consumer behavior redesign. This systematic violation of industry competitive orthodoxies created conditions where traditional market leaders became structurally unable to respond effectively without abandoning fundamental business model characteristics that define their competitive advantages and market positioning within existing architectural frameworks. The market displacement mechanism operated through systematic consumer acquisition patterns that fundamentally altered competitive dynamics rather than achieving superior performance within existing competitive frameworks. The critical technical artifact that reveals this process is the Blue Ocean Strategy Canvas analysis, which demonstrates how Yellowtail created a completely divergent strategic profile from both premium and budget wine categories through systematic elimination and creation of competitive factors. This strategic profile divergence enabled uncontested market space creation, where demand was generated rather than competed for, making traditional competitive responses structurally irrelevant. Consumer acquisition occurred through systematic engagement of previously excluded market populations rather than theft of existing wine consumer market share. Yellowtail attracted multiple consumer segments simultaneously through different value propositions that traditional industry architecture could not deliver. Non-wine drinkers, discovered accessible entry points that eliminated intimidation barriers and education requirements that had systematically excluded their market participation. Budget wine consumers experienced value proposition improvements that provided better quality and social acceptability at comparable price points. Premium wine consumers gained convenience and accessibility without requiring sophistication investment or appreciation development. The multi-segment appeal mechanism operated through architectural design that optimized different value attributes for distinct consumer populations within a single product offering. Accessibility features attracted consumers who had avoided wine due to complexity intimidation. Improved taste profiles provided immediate satisfaction for consumers accustomed to beer and cocktail experiences. Social acceptability eliminated pretension barriers that had prevented casual drinking occasions. Price positioning above budget categories suggested quality improvement while remaining accessible to non-premium consumers. Visual design created brand recognition advantages that simplified selection processes without expertise requirements. Traditional wine industry producers operated within constraint systems that prevented effective competitive response to Yellowtail's architectural innovation. Premium producers possessed aging infrastructure investments, complexity-focused production capabilities, and educated consumer base expectations that required sophistication maintenance for brand identity preservation. Budget producers operated with cost optimization imperatives and scale requirements that prevented architectural redesign toward accessibility and barrier elimination. Both segments faced systematic organizational constraints that made alternative positioning impossible without fundamental business model transformation. Premium wine producers could not abandon complexity signals, aging requirements, and sophistication markers without destroying brand value propositions that defined their market positioning and consumer relationships. Their production systems were optimized for traditional quality indicators rather than accessibility features. Distribution relationships required sophistication, communication, and education support that conflicted with simplification strategies. Marketing investments in brand heritage and expertise development could not be rapidly redirected toward accessibility and barrier elimination without undermining existing competitive advantages. Budget wine producers faced different but equally constraining limitations that prevented effective Yellowtail response strategies. Their competitive advantages derived from cost optimization within traditional wine frameworks rather than consumer experience transformation. Production capabilities focused on volume efficiency rather than taste profile optimization for accessibility. Distribution systems emphasized price competition rather than consumer engagement innovation. Marketing resources were insufficient for brand building and consumer behavior modification that architectural innovation required. Market displacement physics operated through reinforcing feedback mechanisms that accelerated Yellowtail's competitive advantages while undermining traditional producers' response capabilities. Volume growth created distribution leverage that enhanced retail presence and shelf space dominance. Brand recognition improvements reduced marketing costs while increasing consumer selection probability. Scale economies from focused production enabled cost advantages that traditional producers with diverse portfolios could not match. Consumer satisfaction rates generated positive word-of-mouth marketing that traditional advertising approaches could not replicate effectively. Quantitative performance metrics demonstrated systematic market capture rather than temporary competitive success. Cumulative sales reached 25 million cases by 2005, establishing Yellowtail as the overall best-selling 750 milliliters red wine in America, surpassing established California French and Italian brands with centuries of market presence and distribution advantages. By 2005, Yellowtail outsold all French wine producers combined in the American market, representing unprecedented market share capture by a single brand introduction. Volume growth trajectory indicated sustained demand expansion rather than market share redistribution among existing competitors. Cost structure advantages emerged through architectural design choices that eliminated traditional wine industry expense categories while optimizing consumer value delivery. Aging process elimination removed infrastructure requirements, inventory carrying costs, and time-to-market delays that traditional producers considered essential quality development mechanisms. Reduced varietal complexity provided production economies of scale that diversified portfolios could not achieve. Immediate consumption optimization eliminated cellaring requirements and storage cost considerations that traditional wine categories imposed on consumers. Value innovation represented the most significant departure from traditional wine industry competitive logic through simultaneous achievement of cost reduction and customer value increase. Traditional industry assumptions held that differentiation and cost leadership represented mutually exclusive competitive strategies requiring trade-off optimization. Yellowtail demonstrated that architectural redesign could eliminate this trade-off through consumer barrier removal and accessibility enhancement that reduced production complexity while improving consumer satisfaction and market accessibility. The reinforcing feedback mechanism created accelerating competitive advantages that traditional producers could not overcome through incremental improvements within existing frameworks. Distribution leverage enabled rapid market expansion that exceeded traditional brand-building timeframes. Consumer satisfaction rates generated repeat purchasing and recommendation patterns that traditional marketing investments could not replicate efficiently. Brand recognition advantages reduced consumer education requirements while increasing selection probability in competitive retail environments. Traditional industry competitive responses proved systematically inadequate because they addressed optimization challenges within flawed architectural premises rather than questioning fundamental assumptions about consumer behavior and value creation mechanisms. Attempts to improve sophistication communication, enhance education provision, or optimize price points within existing complexity frameworks failed to address the fundamental accessibility advantages that Yellowtail achieved through architectural innovation and assumption challenge. The point of no return occurred when traditional competitive logic became structurally incapable of generating effective responses to architectural innovation that operated outside established competitive parameters. Blue Ocean's success attracted numerous copycat attempts, but Yellowtail's first-mover advantages, scale economies, and brand recognition provided protection against direct imitation, while traditional producers faced impossible strategic choices between identity preservation and competitive response capability. Established producers confronted systematic constraints that made effective response impossible without fundamental business model transformation that would eliminate their existing competitive advantages while attempting to replicate architectural innovations they lacked organizational capability to implement effectively. Yellowtail's market dominance stabilization created secondary system effects that revealed how architectural innovation success generates inevitable competitive responses and market transformation dynamics. The critical technical artifact demonstrating this process was the copycat brand proliferation pattern and blue ocean to red ocean competitive transition that systematically eroded uncontested market space while creating industry-wide structural changes. These stabilization attempts paradoxically generated new vulnerabilities and market positioning challenges that threatened long-term sustainability of the original architectural advantages. Brand power consolidation provided initial stabilization mechanisms through recognition achievements that validated market positioning and competitive advantages. Yellowtail achieved designation as world's most powerful wine brand by Wine Intelligence Global Brand Power Index, representing systematic measurement validation of brand equity and market influence. The brand became the first wine company to advertise during the U.S. Super Bowl in 40 years, reaching a target audience of 150 million viewers, and demonstrating mainstream market penetration beyond traditional wine consumer demographics. These recognition milestones indicated successful transition from market disruption to established competitive presence. Portfolio diversification represented systematic expansion beyond initial architectural limitations while attempting to maintain core accessibility principles. Product line development expanded from the original 2 varietals to 23 different single varietals and blends, providing consumer variety while preserving simplification advantages that define the original market positioning. Brand extension initiatives included Jammy Red Rue and Yellowtail Pure Bright targeting health-conscious consumer segments, demonstrating adaptation to evolving market preferences while maintaining architectural coherence. Geographic market diversification reduced dependency on American market performance through expansion into United Kingdom, Japan, and additional global markets. Despite international growth, the United States remained approximately 50% of total volume, indicating successful market presence maintenance while reducing concentration risk through geographic distribution. Revenue growth sustained through diversification strategies reached $359 million by 2021, demonstrating long-term viability and market positioning strength. However, architectural innovation success inevitably attracted competitive responses that systematically eroded uncontested market space advantages. The blue ocean of simplified, accessible wine quickly populated with numerous competing brands attempting similar positioning strategies. 2 Buck Chuck represented direct competitive response through extreme price positioning while maintaining accessibility features. Dozens of copycat critter wines emerged with animal-themed branding, simplified messaging, and accessibility optimization, directly challenging Yellowtail's unique market positioning. Market transition dynamics demonstrated how blue ocean advantages systematically converted to red ocean competitive environments through imitation and response proliferation. Initial uncontested market space became increasingly competitive as established wine producers and new market entrants recognized demand potential for accessible wine products. Competitive response acceleration created market saturation in simplified wine categories while reducing differentiation advantages that had enabled original market penetration success. Australian wine industry transformation revealed secondary market effects that extended beyond individual brand performance to country-level positioning and perception management challenges. By 2002, Australia captured 20% of U.S. wine import market share primarily due to Yellowtail's success, representing unprecedented market penetration for Australian wine producers. However, this rapid growth attracted excessive budget wine production that systematically altered market perception of Australian wine quality and positioning. Market perception deterioration occurred through association between Australian wine origins and budget pricing strategies that reduced premium positioning opportunities for other Australian producers. The country's wine reputation shifted toward viewing Australia primarily as a cheap wine producer rather than a quality wine region, creating systematic disadvantages for premium Australian wine brands attempting sophisticated market positioning. This perception transformation reduced country brand equity and created competitive disadvantages for Australian wine exports. Import market share decline demonstrated long-term consequences of positioning strategy decisions on industry-wide performance. Australian wine import percentage declined from 20% in 2002 to 10% by 2012, representing loss of half the country's market share within 10 years. This decline indicated systematic market repositioning away from Australian wine products as competitive alternatives emerged and consumer preferences evolved beyond initial accessibility attraction factors. Long-term sustainability concerns emerged around consumer taste evolution patterns that could undermine fundamental architectural advantages. Consumer research suggested potential risk that Yellowtail customers might develop preferences for traditional wine characteristics including tannins, acid complexity, and sophisticated flavor profiles that the brand had systematically eliminated. If consumer palates evolved toward appreciation for traditional wine qualities, Yellowtail's positioning could transform from competitive advantage to market limitation. Climate change and water scarcity issues in Australian wine regions created production cost pressures requiring potential supply chain transformation and geographic sourcing diversification. Traditional Australian vineyard operations faced increasing environmental constraints that threatened cost advantages and production reliability. Strategic response options included global sourcing arrangements that could maintain cost advantages while preserving brand identity, though consumer acceptance of non-Australian sourcing remained uncertain. Supply chain flexibility provided potential stabilization mechanisms through global production optimization while maintaining brand consistency and consumer recognition advantages. Consumer research indicated that yellowtail buyers would likely accept wine sourced from Chile, South Africa, France, or other regions if quality standards and price positioning remained consistent with brand expectations. Brand strength provided operational flexibility for supply chain optimization without necessarily generating consumer rejection or market positioning deterioration. Competitive response management required continuous innovation within accessibility framework principles while defending against market share erosion through imitation and competitive positioning. Traditional wine producers began adopting simplified messaging, accessible pricing, and barrier elimination strategies that directly challenged Yellowtail's unique market advantages. Maintaining competitive leadership required architectural innovation beyond initial simplification strategies while preserving core accessibility benefits that defined consumer value propositions. Market maturation dynamics indicated systematic transition from disruption phase to competitive management phase requiring different strategic capabilities and resource allocation priorities. Initial architectural innovation advantages became table stakes for market participation rather than unique differentiators, necessitating continuous capability development and competitive advantage renewal within increasingly saturated market categories. The critical uncertainty centered on whether simplified wine positioning could maintain market leadership effectiveness as consumer preferences evolved, competitive responses intensified, and market maturation reduced differentiation opportunities that had enabled original disruption success and sustained competitive advantage maintenance. Post-incident analysis validation revealed Yellowtail's market domination as systematic architectural disruption rather than superior marketing execution within existing competitive frameworks. The forensic evidence demonstrated that success resulted from fundamental questioning of industry assumptions about consumer behavior and value creation mechanisms, not optimization improvements within traditional wine industry competitive logic. The critical technical artifact validating this conclusion was comprehensive market share transformation data, combined with Australian wine industry repositioning evidence that confirmed systematic rather than episodic market disruption. The 4 actions framework implementation provided concrete methodology validation for creating divergent competitive profiles that rendered traditional industry positioning irrelevant. Elimination of complexity factors, including aging requirements, technical terminology, and sophisticated appreciation prerequisites, removed systematic barriers that had excluded 85% of potential wine consumers. Reduction of industry standard practices through simplified varietal selection, accessible taste profiles, and immediate consumption optimization eliminated intimidation mechanisms while maintaining product category participation. Price elevation above budget wine categories suggested quality improvement without premium sophistication requirements. Creation of accessibility features including visual design differentiation, simplified selection processes, and barrier elimination generated entirely new value propositions. Strategic reorientation effectiveness, from competitors to alternatives and from customers to non-customers, enabled market expansion impossible through traditional competitive approaches. Traditional wine industry focus on existing wine consumer retention and satisfaction. Optimization ignored vastly larger consumer populations who actively avoided wine purchases due to systematic exclusion mechanisms. Alternative beverage analysis revealed that beer, spirits, and ready-to-drink cocktails captured 3 times wine market volume through accessibility, simplicity, and immediate satisfaction delivery, rather than education requirements and sophistication development. Blue Ocean strategy tools, including strategy canvas analysis and 4 actions framework, provided systematic methodology for identifying uncontested market space through assumption challenge rather than competitive benchmarking optimization. Traditional competitive analysis focused on existing wine producer capabilities and performance metrics within established sophistication frameworks. Blue Ocean analysis questioned fundamental assumptions about consumer behavior patterns and value creation mechanisms, revealing market expansion opportunities through consumer barrier elimination rather than existing consumer satisfaction enhancement. Partnership structure advantages highlighted family business decision-making speed and commitment levels versus corporate quarterly optimization constraints that systematically prevented architectural innovation and risk tolerance required for fundamental business model transformation. Family ownership enabled long-term investment perspectives, rapid strategic pivots, and resource allocation flexibility that publicly held companies could not replicate due to shareholder return requirements and quarterly earnings optimization imperatives. Distribution partnership timing provided market access advantages when established relationships underwent consolidation that created opportunity windows for alternative arrangements. Information architecture impact analysis revealed how traditional wine industry competitive factors functioned as systematic exclusion mechanisms rather than consumer value drivers. Aging, complexity, and prestige requirements served as entry barriers that prevented market participation rather than quality indicators that enhanced consumer satisfaction. Industry feedback systems reinforced complexity bias through expert validation mechanisms including wine show competitions, critic rating systems, and sommelier education programs that emphasized sophisticated appreciation rather than consumer accessibility optimization. Traditional industry training systems, retail organization principles, and marketing communication strategies assumed consumer willingness to invest effort in appreciation development rather than optimizing immediate satisfaction and accessibility. This assumption misalignment created systematic vulnerability to alternative approaches that prioritized consumer barrier elimination over sophistication communication and education provision. Industry participants remained constrained by embedded systems that prevented recognition of fundamental competitive vulnerabilities and alternative value creation possibilities. Value innovation achievement through simultaneous cost reduction and customer value increase challenged fundamental industry trade-off assumptions and demonstrated architectural redesign potential beyond traditional competitive optimization limitations. Traditional wine industry logic held that differentiation and cost leadership represented mutually exclusive strategic choices requiring trade-off optimization between quality enhancement and cost management. Yellowtail proved that consumer barrier elimination could reduce production complexity while improving consumer satisfaction, market accessibility, and competitive positioning simultaneously. Customer acquisition occurred across all market segments through different value propositions delivered within a single product architecture. Non-wine drinkers gained accessible entry points without intimidation barriers. Budget wine consumers received improved quality and social acceptability at comparable price points. Premium wine consumers obtained convenience and accessibility without sophistication investment requirements. Retail staff could recommend products they understood without requiring technical expertise or sophistication communication capabilities. This multi-segment appeal contradicted traditional industry assumptions about targeted marketing requirements and consumer segmentation optimization. Industry transformation lessons emerged around architectural thinking versus operational excellence as fundamental strategic capabilities. Market leadership required creating new consumer behavior patterns rather than optimizing existing consumer satisfaction within established frameworks. Yellowtail created market demand rather than competing for existing market share, demonstrating demand generation potential when consumer barrier elimination replaced competitive benchmarking and sophistication enhancement strategies. Systematic lesson validation confirmed that embedded industry assumptions created structural vulnerability patterns that made market leaders systematically unable to respond to architectural innovation. Traditional competitive logic prevented architectural innovation recognition because industry analysis frameworks focused on existing competitor optimization rather than fundamental assumption challenge about consumer behavior and value creation mechanisms. Competitive responses that emphasized superior sophistication, enhanced education provision, or optimized price points within existing frameworks failed to address fundamental accessibility advantages achieved through assumption challenge. Market leadership sustainability required continuous architectural innovation beyond initial simplification strategies while preserving core accessibility benefits that defined consumer value propositions. Traditional industry feedback systems reinforced complexity bias rather than consumer accessibility optimization, creating systematic constraints that prevented architectural innovation recognition and competitive response capability development within established organizational structures. The yellowtail phenomenon validates the forensic conclusion established through systematic analysis. Traditional wine industry operated according to sophistication assumptions that systematically excluded potential consumers through complexity requirements and education barriers. Market domination occurred not through superior wine production capabilities or marketing execution excellence, but through superior consumer architecture design that eliminated systematic exclusion mechanisms and created accessible value propositions for previously unreachable consumer populations. The failure was fundamentally structural rather than operational. Embedded industry assumptions about consumer behavior, value creation mechanisms, and competitive advantage sources created predictable vulnerability patterns that made wrong decisions not merely plausible, but inevitable within existing competitive logic frameworks. Traditional producers possessed organizational constraints, system dependencies, and assumption entrenchment that prevented recognition of architectural opportunities and competitive response capability development when fundamental design premises were systematically challenged through alternative consumer engagement logic.